All right, hello, good people, and welcome back to Civics Unit 8 on Government and the Economy. This is Lesson 2, Part 2, Economic Indicators. So, in the previous part of Lesson 2, we talked about circular flow and the business cycle. So, when we talk about how our economy works, we like to focus on two main areas in the business cycle. We like to talk about expansion and recession. So, when we are in an expansion or if we're in a recession, economic indicators, there are four of them total. We can kind of look at them either increasing or decreasing or how their overall health is, and we can kind of see a general vibe for our economy. All right, so we talked about the word economy a little bit, and we need to go ahead and define that because that's kind of important. All right, so we can go ahead and define the word economy in our context as wealth and resources of a country, specifically through goods and services. And remember because we are smart that goods are things that you can hold and services are things you pay someone to do on your behalf. So an economy essentially is just kind of all the stuff that we produce, all the services, all the things we ship around either in the United States, within our state, within our county, out of the country, any of that, all the stuff that we make, all the wealth that we're producing, not just the cash, all of that together is our economy. So, like we talked about, those four things in circular flow that impact the health of our economy and just movement of resources and money in general: government, households, business firms, banks, and also something we haven't really touched on too much is the stock market. They all impact each other to influence the overall health of our economy. So, how do we even know if the economy is healthy? How do we measure it? So someone can say like our economy is one of the fastest growing in the world. Okay, that means we're speedy, but does that mean we're secure? Not necessarily. So the first indicator that we can use is called gross domestic product, or GDP. All right. So gross for us does not mean nasty, okay, or like, ugh, that's gross. Gross in terms of economics means total. All right. So if someone says like, oh yeah, our gross profit last year was $100,000. Congrats, you have to pay taxes and also pay the people that you work with. But in general, gross is your total earnings. And then domestic means here at home, so not a foreign good. It's something that has been produced, at least largely so, or mostly so, in the United States. So this is the total value of all new goods and services sold in one year. I highly recommend that beside this you put new, N-E-W, in parentheses. This does not include any imports. It also doesn't include any used items. So for example, this our pal over here, who bought a house to contribute to the 2015 GDP. Ha ha ha. That house was built in 1941, which means that that house contributed to the 1941 GDP and cannot ever be counted again. So, for example, my personal home was built in 1921. She's 101 years old. Congrats to her. She's still kicking. She's doing great. All right. My house was counted in the 1921 GDP. She is not a new good or service, so she cannot be counted again. All right, or like a vehicle that was built or like sold in 2016 or maybe 2017, it was counted in the 2017 GDP. It's not new. So anything that is made this year, like anything you buy and sell on Facebook Marketplace, or you buy off StockX that somebody else is selling because you decided you wanted some dunks or whatever, all right, none of that counts in this year's GDP unless that particular good or service, if they're dunks from this year, yes, congrats, you have contributed to the GDP and to the overall health of our economy. But if not, you have kind of like you just bought or sold something. It's not necessarily in this particular year. All right. The next indicator that we have is the standard or the cost of living. If you will go ahead and not write allows for substitutions, please write rent/housing under standard or cost of living. So this measures the change in the average price level of goods and services. It also measures the change in how much it costs to live in a particular place. So your standard of living is like, what is our baseline? So when someone says like someone who lives above the poverty line in the United States, what does poverty look like here to us in the United States in a relatively developed country as opposed to maybe Haiti or the Dominican Republic, or Peru, or South Africa, or China, or North Korea, or France. So here in the United States, what do we think of as like our baseline? What's rent cost here in the United States versus rent in like, I don't know, Berlin, Germany, or I don't know, in maybe New Delhi, India. Okay, so the cost of living in the United States versus somewhere else kind of shows us how we are doing in general. Now, I'm going to scoot back over here to GDP for just a second. We want gross domestic product to increase. So beside GDP, if you will kindly draw an up arrow and a smiley face, we want GDP to increase. That means that we have produced more goods and services. Now, us in the standard cost of living, let's put an arrow to the side. So a sideways arrow and a smiley face. We want it to be as neutral as it can, because if the rent increases, but your wages do not increase, that's not easy for you to have to kind of figure out on your own. So if you only make $3,000 a month, but your rent has increased by $100 a month, that's not helpful. You're going to have to redo your budget. So your cost of living, if it's relatively high or relatively low, depends on a lot of different factors. We can probably safely say that the cost of living here in the United States is pretty high. Okay, so when we talk about the highest cost of living, notice how we are orange. The only thing that's kind of worse is most of Western Europe, Scandinavia, so Sweden, Finland, and Norway, little baby Iceland over here. This is Japan. Japan has a relatively high cost of living because they do have a lot of relatively highly developed cities. And then Australia also, and New Zealand, because they have to import everything or kind of ship new things to them. All right, so lower cost of living, as you can see, are kind of centered in Asia and Russia and Eastern Europe, Mexico, lots of parts of Western South America, parts of Central America as well. All right, so an indicator of the cost of living, that doesn't necessarily mean that your economy is not doing well if you don't have a high cost of living. It just means that kind of your standard for poverty is probably a little higher. Like people who don't have a microwave might be in poverty here in the United States, but people who live, I don't know, maybe in parts of South Africa, people live inside of shipping containers instead of maybe apartments that we are used to here in the United States. That doesn't mean that their life or their quality of life is any higher or lower. It just means that their baseline for what is considered to be like the basics of living is simply different from the United States. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is the unemployment rate. So this is the percent of the population, here's the kicker, that doesn't have a job, but is also actively searching for a job. So someone who is retired does not count in the unemployment rate because they've already been working for however long they had their career, and they are not currently searching for a job. So they are jobless, but they are okay with being jobless. Just like a stay-at-home parent maybe, or someone who is like physically or maybe mentally disadvantaged or disabled and is not able to work a full-time job, or maybe isn't physically capable of doing so. That doesn't mean that they don't want to work. It doesn't mean that someone's like willpower or work ethic is here or there. It simply means that this particular person does not currently have a job and is actively searching for employment. All right, this is a person who does count in the unemployment rate. The lowest unemployment rate we had in our nation's history was about 1.5%, and that was during World War II, when basically everybody was working in order to fight the war effort, either on the front lines as a soldier or here at home. All right, so 6.5% is considered full employment. We want to draw beside unemployment rate a down arrow and a smiley face. We want this to be as low as possible because that means that people are working. And if people are working, they're making money and therefore spending money, which means that we can get our economy expanding as soon as possible. All right, so our unemployment rate has kind of been up, down, and around the corner. If you'll notice, 2020 has a huge skyrocketing unemployment rate. This is from the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics. So this is from the St. Louis Federal Reserve. We'll get into what the Federal Reserve is in a couple lessons from now. But because of COVID, our particular unemployment rate was very high then. The unemployment rate also skyrocketed post 2008 recession. So if you see, this looks awfully similar to the business cycle. Funny how that works. Okay, so the unemployment rate typically looks very similar in its increases and decreases to our business cycle. All right, and then our last one that we'll talk about is the Consumer Price Index. So this is where you do receive the like, back in my day, a loaf of bread was only $1 and now it's 4 and I'm stressed. Okay, so if you've heard anybody who is old in your life, they have probably complained about the price of gas, the price of a loaf of bread, just general normal goods that a typical household would participate in or use. All right, the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, measures the change in the average price level of goods and services. So instead of an increase or decrease, or like an arrow like we've drawn in the other ones, we're going to say steady, S-T-E-A-D-Y, steady, and a smiley face. We want this to steadily increase because that typically means that people's wages are also increasing, typically at a concurrent rate. But in general, sometimes inflation kind of freaks us out a little bit. But things that we can look at for parts of the Consumer Price Index. So what's the cost of food and beverages? What's the cost of rent? What's the cost of maybe a t-shirt or some jeans? Transportation, so like how much does it cost to get an Uber? How much does it cost for gas? Medical care, like how much is a surgery? Recreation, like how much does it cost for a movie ticket? Y'all, I know I sound like an old lady, but when I was in middle school, we were going to the movies every single Friday. I had my parents like drop me off at the movies and like come get like, don't talk to me, come get me in like 3 hours or whatever from the movie theater. Movie tickets were like $7 like a piece, and now they're like 15, and my heart is sad because I feel like I'm old. Okay, so entertainment has changed a little bit, and then this one is education and communication. So what, like, how much is your phone bill? How much does it cost for school fees? Things like that, and then any just other normal goods and services. And again, this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And taken in December of 2021. All right, so when we talk about indicators in the economy, they can be used alone, but it's more accurate to use them maybe in combination to kind of tell the overall health. You don't typically use an indicator alone by itself. So like the unemployment rate is 15%. It sounds like the sky is falling, but it's probably not taking into context like we are in the middle of a full-blown pandemic and have been so for like 2 years now. Yes, unemployment is high, but also there's been a lot of human loss of life. So it doesn't necessarily give all the context to a situation. It's just something to kind of consider when we look at all 4 of these economic indicators. And that has been the conclusion of Civics Unit 8, Lesson 2.